Are you living in one of the most racist states in America? The latest reports suggest that systemic racism is far from being a thing of the past, but which states top the list? And more importantly, why? As an expert, I've delved deep into recent data to uncover the shocking reality. Some states are perpetuating racism in ways you won't believe. From discriminatory laws to racially biased policing, the evidence is alarming. Could your state be fostering an environment of racial hatred? Join me as we expose the 10 most racist states in the USA. 1. Delaware. You know, Delaware, that small state that's often overshadowed by its neighbors? Well, it turns out Delaware is making headlines for all the wrong reasons. I was just as shocked as you when I saw this, so I made sure to double, triple, and even quadruple check the data to be absolutely sure. And yes, it's true. According to the data, a whopping 21.4% of users tweeting about race in Delaware did so in a derogatory way. That's right, over a fifth of the tweets on this sensitive topic were hateful. Now, let's put that into perspective. Compare this to Vermont, which is apparently the least racist state in terms of Twitter activity. Only 6.96% of tweets about race from Vermont were hateful. That's a huge difference, folks. It makes you wonder, what is going on in Delaware? How can such a small state have such a high percentage of derogatory tweets about race? Delaware, as many of you might know, is often referred to as the first state because it was the first to ratify the Constitution. It's a state with a rich history and has been home to many influential figures. But this data shows that there's a significant issue that needs to be addressed. It's not just about numbers on a screen, it's about the real impact of these hateful messages on the community. 2. South Dakota. Now, despite being right next to Wyoming, which is apparently one of the least racist states according to some studies, South Dakota is a whole different story. This state definitely deserves its spot on the list of most racist states. Here's why. First off, a whopping 20% of tweets referencing race in South Dakota are derogatory. That's right, 1 out of every 5 tweets. It's a pretty clear sign that there's a significant issue with racial attitudes among the population. South Dakota also has the second worst employment gap by race in the entire country. What does that mean? It means that there's a huge disparity between the employment rates of different races. If you're not white, you're much more likely to be unemployed, and if you do have a job, chances are you're earning a lot less than your white counterparts. This brings us to the next point. South Dakota has the worst income gap by race. The difference in income between white people and people of color is larger here than anywhere else in the United States. WalletHub, which does all kinds of rankings and studies, actually ranks South Dakota as the 3rd most segregated state when it comes to the workplace, schools, and voting booths. Think about that for a second. In 2023, we've still got states that are highly segregated. That's not something we should be proud of, and it speaks volumes about the systemic racism that's still very much alive. Now, let's talk demographics. South Dakota is one of the least white Great Plains states, with just 84% of the population identifying as white. A significant portion of the population is indigenous, which is crucial context. Given this diversity, you'd think there'd be more acceptance and integration, but sadly, that's not the case. In fact, the opposite seems to be true. There are countless first-hand accounts that illustrate the everyday racism experienced by Native Americans in South Dakota. Take this example from Reddit, where one user says, "I won't sugarcoat this. I have seen first-hand landlords and employers reject applicants solely from Native American names and appearances. They told me to my face they do it regularly." That's not some isolated incident. It's part of a broader pattern of discrimination that affects many aspects of life for Native Americans in the state. And it's not just about housing and employment. Another Reddit user shared their experience applying for a law enforcement position. They said, "I applied for a law enforcement position and was asked by the interview board if I would pull people over solely for being Native 3 times before I walked out." Imagine that, being asked to target people based on their race during a job interview for a position in law enforcement. It's absolutely unacceptable, yet it happens. The history of racism towards Native Americans in South Dakota is long and painful. From the violent clashes of the past to the institutional discrimination of today, it's clear that the state has a serious problem. Despite progress in some areas, racism remains a pervasive issue. Indigenous people continue to face significant barriers in employment, education, housing, and even in interactions with law enforcement. 3. Maine. All right, folks, let's talk about Maine. Now, at first glance, Maine might seem like it's a beacon of anti-racism. The state boasts some impressive statistics. It has the second lowest employment gap by race and the 17th lowest income gap in the country. You might think, wow, Maine must be a great place for everyone. But let's dig a little deeper, because the reality is not as rosy as these numbers suggest. Maine is overwhelmingly white. We're talking over 95% of the population here, and much of the state is incredibly rural, with vast stretches of land where communities are small and isolated. Outside of the Portland area, which is more diverse and cosmopolitan, many Mainers have never even seen a non-white person in real life. This lack of exposure and diversity breeds a kind of ignorance that can easily turn into racism. Now, let me share a story from a Reddit user that really illustrates this point. This person talked about their experience eating lunch at work, where they would often bring in Asian food. Instead of minding their own business, co-workers would make rude and ignorant comments about the food, saying things like, "Why are you eating rice and weird animal parts?" On top of that, they would walk by and mockingly say, "Ching chong," thinking they were being funny. It's not just one isolated incident. This kind of behavior is shockingly common. They don't even realize they're being racist. They think it's just a joke. And it's not just casual racism either. There's a significant presence of Confederate flags in Maine, which is ironic considering Maine is about as far north from the Confederacy as you can get. It's baffling and troubling to see so many Confederate flags flying in a state that fought for the Union in the Civil War. This shows a kind of misplaced rebellion and a connection to racist ideologies that don't belong in the state's history. Racism in Maine also extends to language and online behavior. In real life, it's disturbingly common to hear white people casually using the N-word and expressing racist views, particularly against the Somali immigrant population that has settled in the state. This racism isn't confined to face-to-face interactions. It spills over into the online world as well. In fact, a shocking 19.25% of tweets from Maine regarding race used hateful or racist language. That's nearly 1 in 5 tweets. This statistic underscores the pervasive and insidious nature of racism in the state. So while Maine might have some good-looking numbers on paper when it comes to employment and income gaps, the day-to-day reality for non-white people living there can be quite different. The ignorance and racism, both casual and overt, make it a challenging place for minorities. It's not just about the laws and policies, it's about the culture and attitudes of the people. Until Maine addresses these deeper issues, it's hard to truly call it a non-racist state. 4. Mississippi. I know it's hard to believe, but we're not the worst at everything, at least not this time. Yeah, I know it's surprising. Mississippi sits at number 4 on this list, but don't start celebrating just yet. You see, 18.59% of tweets from this state mention race in a hateful way. That's a pretty significant jump from Hawaii, which tells you a lot about the attitudes here. Mississippi is the only Deep South state on this list, and let's face it, the Deep South has a reputation. Many Reddit users, and let's be honest, a lot of folks in general, consider it the most racist region in the country. So, this study might not be perfect. There's a good chance Mississippi could actually be the worst if we had a more comprehensive look. And why might that be? Well, let's talk about some numbers. Mississippi has the 8th largest employment gap by race. That means there's a significant difference in employment rates between racial groups. It doesn't stop there. The state also has the 12th largest income gap by race. In other words, there's a considerable disparity in earnings between different races, despite the fact that Mississippi has some of the lowest incomes in the nation overall. These economic disparities are a clear sign of systemic issues. But wait, there's more. Just last year, for the first time in history, Mississippi voters decided to remove a Jim Crow-era law from their constitution. This law was specifically designed to prevent Black Americans from holding office. Can you believe it? Mississippi was the only state where someone could win the majority of votes and still be barred from taking office. And guess what? It worked as intended. Despite being the blackest state in the country, no black candidate has ever been elected to any statewide office here. Now, let's delve a bit deeper into why these facts paint Mississippi in such a negative light when it comes to race relations. The employment and income gaps are a direct result of long-standing institutional racism. These gaps mean that Black residents have less access to economic opportunities, which perpetuates poverty and limits upward mobility. This systemic inequality isn't just a relic of the past. It's very much alive today. And the Jim Crow-era law? It's a glaring example of how the state's legal framework was explicitly designed to disenfranchise Black people. This kind of legislation was not just about keeping people out of office. It was about maintaining a social and economic hierarchy that benefited white people at the expense of Black citizens. So when we look at the percentage of hateful race-related tweets, it's not just about social media behavior. It's a reflection of deeper societal issues. The digital hatred we see is a symptom of the broader culture of racism that has been embedded in Mississippi's history and continues to affect its present. 5. Hawaii, the land of rainbows. Now, you might think a place so beautiful and diverse would be a beacon of racial harmony, but there are some surprising issues here. First off, 17.06% of tweets from Hawaii that reference race are deemed derogatory. Now, that's a significant number, but let's dig deeper into what's really going on here. Interestingly, a lot of these offensive tweets come from a place of ignorance rather than outright hate. You see, rap music is hugely popular in Hawaii, but the state doesn't have a substantial Black population. One Redditor put it this way: "You'll hear the N-word a lot on the Big Island, not by racists, but by people who grew up on rap and don't fully realize the severity of the word." So, it's more about people mimicking what they hear in music without understanding the historical and cultural weight of the words they're using. Another user mentioned that the racism you'll encounter in Hawaii isn't usually hostile, but rather very ignorant. They said, "I can't stress enough that Hawaii and the mainland have much different definitions of political correctness. Everyone makes comments about and jokes about race. This shows that the issue here is more about a lack of awareness and education than outright malice. When it comes to institutional racism, Hawaii actually ranks as the least racist state. That's right, it has the lowest employment gap by race and the 8th lowest income gap. Plus, it's ranked as having the best racial integration in workplaces, schools, and voting booths. This means that structurally, Hawaii is doing a lot better than most states in terms of racial equality. But let's get into why some of these issues still exist despite the state's good standing on institutional measures. Hawaii's unique cultural landscape plays a big role. The state is a melting pot of different cultures with a significant Asian and Pacific Islander population. This diversity creates a different dynamic when it comes to race relations compared to the mainland United States. Because of this, the understanding and approach to race and racism can be quite different. For instance, what might be considered blatantly racist or politically incorrect on the mainland might be seen as more acceptable or less severe in Hawaii. This doesn't excuse the behavior but helps explain why certain things happen the way they do. The state's geographical isolation means that cultural exchanges happen differently. People might not be as exposed to the broader national conversations about race and political correctness that are more prevalent on the mainland. This isolation can lead to a kind of cultural bubble where outdated or ignorant views persist longer than they might elsewhere. 6. Wisconsin. You know, when most people think about Wisconsin, they think about dairy, cheese, and the Green Bay Packers. It's all about that Midwest charm and friendly folks, right? But there's a darker side to the state that not many outsiders know about. We're talking about a place with a serious racism problem. In 2020 alone, Wisconsin saw 74 hate crimes. 74! That's a big number for a state known for its friendly Midwestern vibe. Now you might be thinking, well, that's just a fluke. But let me tell you, Wisconsin isn't just having a bad year. It's actually the worst state when it comes to racial integration. Imagine that. In a country that's supposed to be moving forward, Wisconsin is stuck in the past. And if that's not enough, it ranks 43rd in terms of income gap by race. That's pretty shocking, right? It means that people of different races aren't just living separate lives, they're living vastly unequal ones. Even the big shots in the sports world are calling it out. The president of the Milwaukee Bucks, folks, came out and said, Milwaukee is the most segregated, racist place I have ever experienced in my life. That's a bold statement coming from someone who travels all over the country. But you know what? It makes sense. Milwaukee's suburbs, like Brookfield, are steeped in racist history. We're talking about policies like redlining and blockbusting that were designed to keep communities segregated. And let's not forget, Milwaukee's schools were segregated until the 1970s. That's not ancient history, that's our recent past. To give you a more personal perspective, let's talk about what people are experiencing on the ground. There's a Redditor from Brookfield who shared their experience. This person said, "Never in my 30 years have I experienced so much racism and prejudice. I share the same socioeconomic status as many folks in this community, and I am highly educated. Nonetheless, it seems as if all black people are quote-unquote thugs to them. I have been subjected to harsh stereotypes at neighborhood gatherings and been stopped and pulled over many times on my way to or from my house for no reason. In fact, my husband had the cops called on him and was accused of breaking into our own home just for moving furniture. Can you imagine that? Being treated like a criminal just for living your life. That's the reality for many people in Wisconsin. And it doesn't stop there. Consider this. 16.98% of tweets coming out of Wisconsin that referenced race were hateful. That's nearly 17% of people using social media to spread hate. It's no wonder people feel the way they do. These statistics aren't just numbers. They represent real people facing real discrimination every single day. 7. Kansas. Now, Kansas might not be the first place that comes to mind when you think about racism in America, but let me tell you, it's got some serious issues. This state is where the data shows there's a systemic problem with racism. We're talking about the 34th worst income gap by race and 37th in terms of racial integration. Not exactly something to be proud of, right? I've traveled all over Kansas, and honestly, I'm surprised it didn't rank even lower. Take Wichita, for example. It's like there's a literal line dividing the Black, Latino, and white neighborhoods. You cross one street and you're in a completely different world. The Kansas City suburbs aren't any better. One Redditor put it perfectly, saying, "I think the problem is that the older generation has decided that minority influx, or even the perception of their presence, explicitly causes loss of property value and desirability." That's a polite way of saying they think having minorities around makes their neighborhoods worse. Can you believe that? Another user from rural Kansas chimed in with, "You'll definitely hear unkind comments regarding minorities, in particular quote-unquote illegals and Muslims. So, it's not just about Black and Latino communities. There's a widespread intolerance for anyone who doesn't fit the mold of what some people in Kansas think is normal. It's a sad state of affairs." You might be wondering why so many older folks in Kansas have these views. Well, some of them were alive during the Jim Crow era. They grew up in a time when segregation was the law of the land, and unfortunately, a lot of those racist attitudes seem to have been handed down to the younger generations. It's not just anecdotal evidence either. We've got hard data to back this up. A whopping 16.95% of all tweets referencing race in Kansas did so in a hateful or derogatory way. That's nearly 17% of people on social media spreading hate. Let's add some more context here. The history of Kansas is deeply intertwined with racial issues. This is a state that was a battleground during the Civil War era, known for the violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. You'd think after all that, they'd have learned something about equality. But no, the old prejudices die hard. In Kansas, you can see the remnants of redlining and other discriminatory practices that have kept neighborhoods segregated for generations. The schools in many parts of Kansas are still dealing with the fallout of these policies. You have schools that are predominantly minority and underfunded, while just a few miles away, there are predominantly white schools with all the resources you could ask for. It's a glaring example of how systemic racism perpetuates inequality. And it's not just about income and education. The racial disparities in Kansas extend to healthcare, housing, and employment. Minority communities often face higher unemployment rates and have less access to quality healthcare. It's a vicious cycle that keeps people trapped in poverty and perpetuates the divide between races. 8. Arkansas. You know, folks, it's really no surprise Arkansas made this list when you consider all the evidence. We've seen some pretty shocking things come out of the natural state. I mean, just look at the former sheriff of Arkansas County who was caught on camera spewing racial slurs, including the N-word. It's disgraceful, and it really makes you wonder what's going on down there. Now, it's a bit surprising that Arkansas is only one of 2 southern states to make the cut, especially since we've all heard stories about how racism is rampant in the South. But maybe that's because a lot of the racists down there are older folks who don't use social media like Twitter. You see, these older generations grew up in a different time, and unfortunately, some of them haven't moved past those hateful ideologies. In Arkansas, a staggering 16.83% of tweets discussing race were hateful. This shouldn't be a shocker to anyone who knows the state. After all, Arkansas is home to the largest number of hate groups per capita in the entire country. It's not just hearsay. This is well documented. And let's not forget about Zinc, Arkansas. Zinc is the headquarters of the modern-day Ku Klux Klan. Yes, you heard that right. The KKK is still active and headquartered right there in Arkansas. If that doesn't tell you something about the state's issues with racism, I don't know what will. Now, Zinc is just a stone's throw away from Harrison, Arkansas. Harrison has gained quite the reputation over the years, often being labeled as the most racist town in America. It's sad, really, because not everyone in Harrison holds those views. There's a younger generation there that's trying to change things, trying to move past this dark legacy. But the problem is, many of the older residents are actually proud of their hateful views. They have no shame in showcasing them to the world. You drive through Harrison, and you can see signs and billboards that are just plain racist. These aren't hidden. They're out in the open for everyone to see. It's like stepping back in time to a place where racism is not only accepted, but flaunted. The younger folks are fighting against it, but it's an uphill battle when the older generation is so entrenched in their ways. Arkansas also has a history that's hard to ignore. From the days of segregation to the present, the state has struggled with racial issues. Little Rock, the capital, was a major battleground during the Civil Rights Movement. The Little Rock Nine, those brave African-American students who integrated Central High School, faced unimaginable hatred and violence. It's a part of Arkansas's history that still resonates today. And let's not forget about the state's demographics. Arkansas has a relatively small minority population, which can sometimes lead to a lack of understanding and empathy. When people don't have regular interactions with those who are different from them, it's easier for stereotypes and prejudices to take root and grow. This lack of diversity can contribute to the persistence of racist attitudes. 9. West Virginia. Now, let me tell you folks, West Virginia has earned quite the reputation, and not for the best reasons. You see, there's a whole lot of chatter on Reddit, with numerous posts from people of color expressing their fear of even stepping foot in the state. They say it's known as one of the most racist states in the country. And you know what? The data kind of supports this claim. A significant 16.78% of tweets from West Virginians about race include hateful rhetoric. That's a big number, folks, and it paints a pretty clear picture. Unlike Maryland, where racism tends to be more under the radar, West Virginians are often quite open about their views. Many Reddit users share experiences of hearing white people casually use the N-word, and there's a general consensus advising people of color to stay silent and avoid bars. The mix of racist views and alcohol can lead to dangerous situations, and that's not something to take lightly. One Redditor put it bluntly, "There is a lot of racism here. I know some of y'all are going to tell me you don't see it, but I know you do. When we have to tell people to wear WVU gear, to blend in, and to stay away from bars for their safety, that's a big racism problem." Now, it's important to recognize that not all West Virginians are like this. Many folks are incredibly welcoming and kind. However, with a population that's 97.4% white, especially in the rural areas, a lot of people have never even encountered someone of a different race. This lack of exposure breeds ignorance, and unfortunately, that ignorance can manifest as racism. People fear what they don't know, and in a place where diversity is nearly non-existent, that fear turns into prejudice. Despite these issues, there are a few silver linings. For one, West Virginia boasts the 10th lowest employment gap by race and the second lowest income gap. But before you start celebrating, Let's put this into perspective. One of the reasons for these low gaps is the sheer lack of good-paying jobs. The state's economy is struggling, so there isn't a massive income disparity simply because nearly everyone is facing economic hardship. This paints a pretty complicated picture, doesn't it? On one hand, you have the stark reality of racial prejudice that deters people of color from visiting or living in West Virginia. On the other hand, the economic struggles create an environment where racial gaps in employment and income are minimized, but not for positive reasons. It's a state of contradictions, with a welcoming spirit shadowed by an undercurrent of racism. It's also worth considering the cultural and historical context of West Virginia. The state has a long history rooted in coal mining and rural traditions. These communities are tight-knit and often resistant to change. Introducing new ideas, especially those about race and equality, can be slow and met with resistance. This resistance is not unique to West Virginia, but the state's demographics and economic struggles make it a particularly intense example. 10. Maryland. Now, on the surface, Maryland doesn't seem all that racist, right? It's one of those places where you look at the numbers and think, hey, they're doing pretty good. And in some ways, they are. Maryland is ranked as one of the least systemically racist states in the country. They've got the 12th lowest income gap by race, which means that there's not a huge disparity between what people of different races are making. They're also the 11th most racially integrated state when it comes to workplaces, schools, and even the voting booths. That's a big deal, folks, because it shows that on paper, people of different races are living and working together more than in many other places. But here's where it gets interesting and a bit shocking. Despite all these positive numbers, a whopping 16.59% of Twitter accounts in Maryland that discuss race use hateful or derogatory language. That's a pretty high number, considering how well the state is doing in those other areas. Now, many researchers out there believe that poor education is a big cause of racism. It makes sense, right? If people aren't educated, they're more likely to hold on to outdated and prejudiced views. But here's the kicker. Maryland is the 4th most educated state in the country. So how do you reconcile these two things? You've got a state that's doing well economically and educationally, but still has a significant amount of hate speech online. To understand this, you've got to look at Maryland's history. It's a place with a past that's steeped in racism. Did you know that interracial marriage was illegal in Maryland until 1967? That's not that long ago. And there's more. 2 small towns in northern Maryland, Rising Sun and Thurmont, were once home to the headquarters of a KKK chapter. That's right, the Klan had a presence there, spreading their hateful ideology. And let's not forget about slavery. Maryland, despite being nicknamed the Free State, was one of the last states to outlaw slavery. They didn't do it until November of 1864. That's quite late, folks. So while they've made progress, that kind of history doesn't just disappear overnight. It lingers, especially in the more rural parts of the state. These areas can hold on to those old prejudices longer because they're more isolated from the progress and diversity you might see in bigger cities. Now, don't get me wrong, most people in Maryland today don't act on hateful views. In fact, there were only 11 hate crimes based on race or religion reported in 2020. That's not a lot, which is a good thing, but that doesn't mean those views aren't there. The dark history of racism still lingers. It's like a shadow that's hard to shake off. So while Maryland looks good on paper with its integration and education stats, the reality is more complicated. The past still has a hold in some ways, and you see that reflected in the online discussions.